Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Kenny McBride and joining me tonight is Kathleen Caskey, the manager of the Third Sector Interface Network. Kathleen, thank you very much for joining us.
Hello, yes, nice to be here.
So our first story tonight is the ongoing saga of Brexit. Today, Boris Johnson demanded that the European Union reopen the Brexit deal, but the EU responded fairly strongly that Britain failed to propose any realistic alternative to an agreed insurance policy for the Irish border. Boris Johnson wrote that the backstop was anti-democratic and threatened the United Kingdom's sovereignty as the application of single market rules in Northern Ireland could divide the North from the rest of the UK. This was in a 4-page letter to Donald Tusk. Donald Tusk replied, he said, "I propose that the backstop should be replaced with a commitment to put in place alternative arrangements as far as possible before the end of the transition period as part of the future relationship. Time is very short." Donald Tusk replied that Johnson had proposed no realistic alternatives, and the EU Commission took a very similar line. Donald Tusk tweeted, "Those against the backstop and not proposing realistic alternatives in fact support re-establishing a border, even if they do not admit it." This news brought a near 3-year low for the pound against the euro and the dollar. And really, it doesn't look good. It does seem very much as though Donald Tusk is right, that the policy does seem to be leave without a deal and effectively impose a new border in Ireland. So what do we make of this? Is this bluffing on either side, or is this headed for a real disaster in Ireland, do you think?
I don't think the EU are bluffing. I don't think Boris Johnson necessarily has a forward plan of action. But I also object quite strenuously to the way that the Northern Irish issue is just being used as some kind of negotiating. Should there be a border there? Should it be in the sea? Perhaps, time has passed, but those of us who are older remember the 1970s. We remember the mayhem that there was when the hard men of violence in Northern Ireland had control, where whole communities were intimidated. The Booker Prize winning book last year, The Milkman by Anna Burns, talked about, that sense of intimidation of communities, of the unnaturalness of life there. Northern Ireland is very close to Scotland. It's not some academic thing that I don't even know if Boris Johnson has ever been in Northern Ireland beyond, I think he made a state visit after he was after he became Prime Minister. But I don't think we should lose sight of this isn't an academic problem. There are still people living today in Northern Ireland and in the south with the loss of people who were killed during the war there. We're still living with people suffering the psychological impact of it. This is absolutely crucial. We must keep the border between the Northern Ireland and the south of Ireland open. We must allow that community to continue to heal. It isn't healed yet. So you've got a conundrum. You've got an impossible situation that cannot be resolved. Where does this border go? It needs to go somewhere. If we put it across Ireland, we risk harming the ongoing healing of that dreadful struggle. 3,000 people were killed as a result of the wars over the Constitution in Northern Ireland. Wasn't a small amount. So Northern Ireland effectively has to stay part of the EU regulatory market. So either the rest of us do too, which might be a good thing, or we have a border across the Irish Sea. It is completely unsolvable. Boris Johnson's idea that if he just talks about it and says, I'm holding out long enough, somehow some magical solution will emerge. I don't think it's going to happen. And I think it's a flaw in the entire Brexit process. And I think it's disgraceful that it wasn't discussed during the Brexit referendum, the very real problem that this is now posing. So we are the architects, or the UK is the architect of its own misfortune. It hasn't considered this. It's trying to push the EU up to the wire. And I don't think the EU will abandon Dublin. All the noises coming from the EU are that they will stand by Dublin and they will stand against a hard border in Northern Ireland. It's not so much the border as the regulatory regime, I think, which is important too. Hard borders, anyone who's travelled in the Balkans, you know that a border between the EU and the non-EU can actually be very soft. It can be just a wave through, a drive through. We don't want to over-exaggerate that, particularly as if Scotland went independent, it might want a hard border with England. But a hard border, nonetheless, is to be resisted in Northern Ireland above all, simply because that community isn't healed yet. That community is not whole yet.
Yeah, I mean, the goal of the Good Friday Agreement was always to make it so that if you lived in the north but felt you were Irish, you could effectively live as if you were Irish. You didn't have to think about where the border was. The only real difference was who you paid your taxes to. And there are still, of course, many people who cross the border every day for work. There are farmers who cross the border every day just to go and look at fields of theirs that are on the other side. And there are, of course, stretches of the border where the road zigzags
very wiggly
across it every mile or two. The practicalities of monitoring the Irish border are almost unfathomable.
Unless you bring in a huge military presence, as was there previously, which
seems like exactly what nobody wants.
I think Johnson will give before the EU will.
As you say, this is something that really wasn't raised very much in 2016 during the actual Brexit campaign. Do you think there's maybe a case that since peace was established in Northern Ireland, I mean, effectively just over 20 years ago now, that just the no longer being a squeaky wheel means that Northern Ireland doesn't get the attention that it needs? Is that part of the problem, do you think?
I don't think Northern Ireland ever got the attention it needed when, during the 70s, for example, the human rights, the civil rights of people in Northern Ireland were, wholly oppressed compared to in the mainland UK. One of the things that people always say, I'm never entirely sure if it's true or not, was that when Boris Johnson bought the water cannons when he was the Mayor of London, was that the only place in the UK you were allowed to use water cannons was Northern Ireland. And there was all the joke about he'd wasted this money buying these water cannons. And Northern Ireland was never treated as an equal part of the UK. It's the civil liberties of people there were horrifically oppressed, and the UK state said that was necessary in order to minimise the killings and minimise the violence. I think the way the EU referendum was run was wholly typical of how the UK has always regarded Northern Ireland an afterthought, a bit at the top, full of strange people. I've always wondered about the people with a very strong sense of British identity in Northern Ireland, because the British state has never been kind to them. It has never considered them their equal. It's always treated them with a certain amount of disdain. It was obvious to everybody that this was going to be an issue if we voted to leave, but somehow it wasn't talked about. Similarly, with Gibraltar, which was always going to be an issue and seems to have been not in the news very much. We don't really know what's happening there, but obviously there's going to be an impact there as well. So, I genuinely think that the EU referendum was one of the most dishonest political processes we've engaged in for many a long year, not least because these issues weren't raised and discussed at the time, and now they're coming home to roost. There is not a solution to the Northern Irish backstop. There simply isn't. If you want a hard Brexit, if you want no EU regulation, if you want absolute freedom from EU, there is not a solution that I can see or that I've read anyone else who's more intelligent or informed than me has been able to come up with. You have to have a hard border, and that will undermine peace. That's the reality of it. It's a dreadful situation, appalling.
Now, the assumption that we make, and we're always it's usually a good principle to assume incompetence before malice. Do you think this was incompetence, that the Brexiteers just really never thought about Northern Ireland?
Oh, absolutely.
Because, as you say, it's just a second thought, barely even a second thought a lot of the time for the British government? Or do you think that possibly the intention, given that the Tories are currently propped up by the DUP, who themselves were very heavily pro-Brexit, that the goal is in fact to say, well, we're not going to put up a border, and then leave with no deal and essentially force Ireland to establish border controls, because the EU is then going to have to put pressure on Ireland to do that, so that they can effectively create a hard border but not have to take the blame for it. I mean, that's a very cynical interpretation, but it's...
I genuinely think people didn't really think it through. I genuinely think that we all know that Boris Johnson didn't want to win. He did not want to win the Brexit referendum. We all saw his face when it was announced that, the UK had voted to leave the EU. He was terrified. He had expected to lose. He had hoped to lose. He had hoped to have a platform for his own political career. And then he won. And you could just see that look on his face, that what have I done look. And I don't think he's done much more thinking or analysing since. He's messing along, trying to make the best of whatever happens to cross his desk on that particular day. I don't think Boris Johnson is a stupid man, but I don't think he's a thoughtful man. And sometimes being thoughtful is more important than, being able to speak in Latin and having gone to Eton or Oxford. An actual quality of thoughtfulness, and that's something that Johnson lacks. And I think the EU have that quality of thoughtfulness, and I think Johnson will lose. I think he will lose against the EU in this bluff and double bluff war that he's in, because, as I say, I genuinely believe the EU will not abandon Dublin, and I know that Dublin believes that the EU will not abandon them to their fate and that they will stand together, and that leaves the UK the isolated party.
Yeah, well, Boris Johnson is due to meet with Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron later on this week. That'll be their first meeting since Johnson became Prime Minister. Of course, the EU has already said it's not reopening the withdrawal agreement. And a Finnish government spokesman said today that this was also the message that Johnson had heard from their Prime Minister, Antti Rinne, during a phone call yesterday. Prime Minister Rinne reiterated that the withdrawal agreement will not be reopened. It certainly seems like the EU has taken a very strong line on this. I
trust Angela Merkel. She's a very wise, intelligent, and has that quality of thoughtfulness about things. I'm sure she'll give as much as she's able. I'm sure she'll seek to find a negotiate. I mean, I do. The hope of us all is in Angela Merkel that she is able to somehow come to some arrangement or some sense with Boris Johnson, and she's our last great hope, I suppose.
Given that the Tories are now down to a majority of just one, Jeremy Corbyn has been talking about a potential vote of no confidence come September 3rd when Parliament reconvenes. Is there actually any political space for Johnson to change his mind now? Or do you think that the Brexiteers in his own party and the threat of the Brexit party should a general election be held? Is that a risk, do you think, in him softening at all? I mean, for example, I saw Nigel Farage saying the other day that Boris's choices were to deliver or die.
Charming.
In so many words, which, frankly, coming from Nigel Farage with the history of the Brexit movement and what happened with Joe Cox and everything, to me is just terrifying language to be using. Do you think that there is any scope for Johnson to soften?
Gosh, you'd hope so. I mean, Johnson unleashed these demons himself. He is responsible for the demons that have been unleashed. And at his back, he always hears the Brexit party coming near. That these Brexit or die type people, as you say, what appalling language. They scare me. They are our Trumpites. They are, the equivalent of these, lock her up, make America great again types. We have unleashed a terrible kind of force in the Western democracies of this kind of populist, angry populism. And it is quite terrifying. And I suspect that Boris will be quite terrified by it too, because, as you say, his political authority, his political majority is very, very narrow. The fact that Joe Swinson at the Lib Dems and Jeremy Corbyn don't seem to be able to, they actually seem to dislike each other. They seem to have very little warmth or ability to compromise. Doesn't suggest that the opposition, I think the opposition might might not be able to take advantage of Boris Johnson's weakness. I mean, in some ideal scenario, the opposition would come together, they would overthrow Boris and revoke Article 50. We would stay in the EU. That's what would suit people who want to be in the EU. That would suit those of us who see our democratic future in the EU. But we will have unleashed terrible forces upon the country, and I genuinely would be concerned that if, for example, in my unlikely scenario, an Article 50 was revoked, I would be genuinely concerned about civil unrest from the Brexiteer types, from the people that Farage has wound up, has I can't think of the right verb, but in the same way Donald Trump has in America, wound up based on people's lowest fears, people's secret and dark fears have been put out there and used to work people up into a frenzy. I don't see a way out. I'm usually quite good at predicting what's going to happen politically. I cannot see the escape route for any of this. I can't see us being able to leave the EU without the backdrop. I can't see Johnson being the backstop. I can't see Johnson being able to renegotiate it. I can't see Johnson continuing to command the Parliament. I can't see where the alternative to Johnson is going to come in the current parliamentary setup. It's a mess. It's an absolute mess. And we'll be sitting here in a year's time. Hopefully things will be clearer and perhaps something will have happened that we wouldn't have predicted, that we wouldn't have thought of. But at the moment, I can't see what that is. I think we're stuck. I think worse, we might extend for another year. We might extend for we just keep extending the date in which Brexit's going to happen. That seems to be the least worst option, but I don't think it's politically sustainable for Johnson because he's talked such a big game about it with no sense of trepidation, no sort of, he's gone in full bore. We will leave. We will definitely do it. He hasn't left himself any wiggle room. That's a sign of a bad politician, not to leave himself any wiggle room at all,
Mm-hmm. We also heard today from Jeremy Corbyn himself with regard to announcements that freedom of movement would effectively end completely on the 31st of October if there is no deal. And Jeremy Corbyn said this would be a situation like Windrush on steroids, and that the idea was utterly ludicrous. He said, "Does this mean that a European Union national living in this country, possibly as a doctor, a nurse, a trauma surgeon, all kinds of things, goes home to see their family in Germany or the Czech Republic or wherever else, and then they're not allowed back into this country? Is this another Windrush on steroids?" There are 2 million EU citizens resident in Britain who have not yet registered for settled status. The deadline is June of 2021, or technically December 2020 if the UK leaves the EU without a deal, although between the end of October and December 2020 they would technically have no official right to be in the country. Corbyn said he didn't believe Boris Johnson was serious about any form of negotiation with the EU, and said he needs to recognise that just holding the threat of a no deal on 31st October towards the European Union isn't going to bring about a change. It is going to make things much worse. He created this arbitrary date by his behaviour during the Tory leadership campaign. He needs to wise up and stop the nonsense with the 31st of October and start talking seriously. Diane Abbott said that the chaos and confusion for EU citizens would make the Windrush scandal look like a minor blip, and that EU citizens who had not registered would be in the exact same situation as the Windrush people. She said there's no possibility of 2 million registering between now and the 31st of October, and then those EU nationals that were here but haven't registered for settled status will be in the exact same position as the Windrush people. I would just like to stress that even the language they're using there is probably not accurate. It's not a registration for settled status, it's an application for settled status. People can and have been refused for seemingly quite arbitrary reasons with no right of appeal. This is, I think, perhaps again an example of this kind of quite hard populist right-wing rhetoric that we're seeing in a number of countries around the world. Just now you mentioned the US, obviously. But this anti-immigrant sentiment that's been a big driving force behind the Brexit vote, seeing it ramped up like this, the possibility that 2 million people come the end of October may have no legal right to be here, what do we think is the outlook for those people?
Terrifying, absolutely terrifying. They'll have children at schools here. They'll have, jobs, houses, mortgages. To know that, to have that level of uncertainty and potential disruption, the psychological impact alone is traumatising. I know that, I know you said it wasn't registration, it was an application. I mean, we really do need to keep urging people who perhaps don't know yet, and I can't think there would be many, but just in case, please do try and register. Citizens Advice Bureaus have brought on specialist people to help advise in this. I'm always keen to encourage people to take the help and support that's out there. But yes, there will be millions who don't go through the process and who probably might not even have particularly thought about it. They're living their life. They may have been here some time, children in school. We're all very guilty of burying our head in sand and saying, well, it won't impact on me, it won't affect me. Yeah, I think it is going to be absolutely horrifying. You're talking about the idea of doctors being held up at airports, not allowed back in. Where has this idea came from? There was no need for it. We could have just said, well, bit of wait and see, bit of fudge. The phrase I used earlier, kept a bit of wriggle room. To say, as of the 31st of October, that's it, people no longer have a legal right to stay, is just, I genuinely am at a loss to know why anyone thinks it's a good idea or what they think it's going to achieve. We already know that the ending of freedom of movement is going to cause huge problems in this country, not least in so many of those jobs that EU immigrants have done and have carried out in caring for our elderly. We've got this ageing demographic, and people, to be fair, from poorer EU countries have come and done the work, filled the jobs that people in the UK haven't wanted to do or haven't been able to do. Who is going to be left to do that kind of work? I know the tourism trade, some of the agricultural trades, entirely dependent on EU labour. I was over in Islay a couple of weeks ago, and it was a clam factory, a seafood factory. All the workers in the factory were Bulgarian. It was a group of men from Bulgaria that were over doing that work. The Islay people are doing other work. They're all, working at the distillery. Who is going to do these jobs? What is going on? There's something utterly chilling, I would say, chilling to the bone about some of this. I don't know if I would use, the Windrush and steroids and, all rhetoric of that kind, could be slightly over the top. But anyone who isn't chilled by this, and anyone who just thinks it's great, make the UK great again or make Scotland great again, they're not paying attention to what the actual impact is going to be. And even if people do register, even if they do get, permission to stay, if you were an EU resident, if you were someone with skills and language skills, would you want to stay here? If there's other opportunities where you're going to be better welcomed, better settled. So a lot of people just will leave, I think, and it will be to the detriment of this country and to the detriment of our economy and to the detriment of those, the NHS, the care services, as I say, tourism, agriculture, where the EU, people coming from the EU have been what have helped us to, maintain a degree of prosperity. It's chilling.
Joanna Cherry, the SNP Westminster spokesperson on Justice and Home Affairs, said something quite similar. EU nationals make an extremely valuable contribution to this country. However, the Tory government's hostile approach to immigration is now targeting those very same citizens, many of whom have lived, worked and contributed to Scotland for most of their lives. Ending the freedom of movement on 31st October would mean that EU citizens unable to prove their right to remain in the UK would be made unlawful residents overnight, exposing them to the hostile environment policy. And I think, I have some contacts in Govan Hill, and of course there's a fairly sizable Roma community there. And what I've heard is that they're quite unwilling to engage with many government public services because in the countries where they've come from, being Roma almost always meant you were discriminated against in some way and treated quite badly. And there's already a history of the DWP treating that group incredibly badly. So there's, with certain groups, there is this feeling of not wanting to have their name on a list, because once their name's on a list, that means they can be targeted. I know, we have a German girl, Ellen, who hosts the Sunday show here sometimes. who's very unwilling, because having grown up in Germany, she has been taught for her entire life, you don't have a list with a particular group of people on it. No. That's just that's the beginning of the very bad things, you know, that's something that I think probably hasn't even crossed the minds of the Home Office, that there might be people who have a genuine, legitimate fear about standing up and saying, yeah, I'm here. Because their goal in life is to stay under the government's radar as much as they possibly can.
Yes, no, I mean, I know Govan Hill myself, and I know the community there, as you say, culturally don't engage with public services. And I know that lots of people in that community have spent a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of the third sector organisations, you know, helping the Roma community to understand about registering with doctors, registering with schools, that we will try not to have the kind of discriminatory treatment they've received back in their home countries. And yeah, I can understand as well also the thoughts of the German guys. Again, I want to avoid and I want to try. I wish politicians would avoid ramping up the rhetoric, but that idea of sort of sleepwalking into something far more sinister and far darker, I think it's at the back of people's minds if they're being thoughtful. But you don't have to be thoughtful if you're being ramped up, if you're waving a flag, if you're making America great again, Brexit now, Nigel Farage. You don't have to be thoughtful. Being thoughtfulness is not a quality that is valued. It's about being straight talking, off the cuff, say what you think, say it like it is. It's a horrible political culture. And I am in some degree of not quite despair, but perhaps despondency about where we're going to end up with all of this.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly there's not a great amount of good news about Brexit for us to talk about. We do talk about it a lot on the show, and I can say from at least the shows I've hosted, the overwhelming feeling does seem to be quite pessimistic. We will keep watching, and we can only hope that something a bit more positive does happen soon. In slightly more positive news, though, a national leadership group has been established to focus on improving the delivery of community justice interventions. So this group is going to meet for the first time tomorrow. Senior leaders from justice, health, local government and social work will identify and coordinate action to further strengthen community justice services and alternatives to custody. They will also focus on increasing public and judicial confidence in community justice by demonstrating its effectiveness in supporting rehabilitation and reducing offending. Humza Yousaf, who's co-chairing the group, said, "Our goal is to change attitudes and support a wider cultural shift that goes beyond simply increasing the proportion of sentences served in the community. We need to strengthen delivery and improve confidence in community justice interventions at every stage, from pre-prosecution through to court and post-sentencing, including helping people leave prison. Clear leadership is required at every level, bringing together the important work already taking place across justice and other services to prevent offending and victimisation." Parliament's backing for the extension of Scotland's presumption against short prison sentences showed that there is already considerable consensus around our evidence-led approach to preventing reoffending. I'm looking forward to working with the group to continue driving improvements at pace and scale, ensuring Scotland's community justice services are the best that they can be. And Councillor Parry, who's the COSLA's community and wellbeing spokesperson, said, who's co-chairing this, said, "Most people understand the difficult circumstances of those who get into trouble with the law, and many would consider alternative to prison if that would reduce the chances of reoffending. I welcome the greater emphasis on community alternatives to custody as an alternative which is likely to be more effective. However, I recognise that public confidence needs to be developed further in these measures. I'm pleased that the National Community Justice Leadership Group has been established to take this broad agenda forward under the joint political oversight of the Scottish Government and local government, given the crucial lead role of local authorities in community justice and the role of the public sector." So this is fairly positive news. I think most people would agree that an evidence-led policy is always better than one led by assumptions and prejudices. And it does seem that short prison sentences do more harm than good. So what do we make of this? What are we hoping to see come out of this new group?
Do you know, I'm hugely engaged with the community justice agenda, and it's been an agenda that third sector organisations across Scotland, in Glasgow, and you know, in everywhere have really engaged with. Slightly wry, perhaps cynical observation would be the presumption against short sentences. I think it was sentences under a year with sentences under 6 months has been in place for some time now. Crime has been falling, and Barlinnie's never been fuller. Barlinnie is so overcrowded that they've had to withdraw the through care service that they were providing, that the Scottish Prison Service were providing. So great initiatives, all the kind words about it, but what we currently have isn't working the way we thought it had, because the number of people in jail should be falling by now. Although I think some of the issues are quite complex to unpick, such as people, older sex offenders taking very long sentences. So really the numbers in jail, a lot of it might be caused by more long sentences rather than short. But it all needs unpicked. However, so putting aside slightly that cynicism, which I think was ramped up, I was at a meeting and the Governor of Barlinnie was at, you know, a couple of weeks ago, and he was making the point that we are full, there just isn't space. It is a good initiative. Community justice ideas do work, and you can see it so clearly in Glasgow, where, and particularly, you know, the work of the Violence Reduction Unit and the ideas that came from that absolute powerhouse of creative thinking, the early intervention that's put in, the use of the third sector to diverse, you know, to create not cause diversions, but to divert, sorry is the word I'm looking for, to divert young people from getting involved in low-level crime that then escalates through the gangs to serious violence, has been absolutely exemplary. And we have seen that in the fall in the number of violent crimes and the number of young people getting engaged in violence in Scotland. The results are there. We haven't got the prison side of it worked out yet. My concern is that sheriffs and High Court judges, but sentencing judges, aren't as convinced of the arguments as the rest of us. My concern is that they say, well, what would be a third sector? Well, what's the funding for this organisation that's going to, you know, provide an alternative to custody? And being the third sector, they'll have 3-year funding or 2-year funding. They won't have 10-year funding. The judges know the prison will always be there. They don't know that these services, diversion services or alternatives to prison services, are always going to be there. It's really complex, it's really nuanced, but I do think there's something about the sentencers, the judges, they have to believe in this system, and I'm not sure that they currently do. Very hard group to engage with, the judges, the judiciary, because they are independent, and long may they remain so. And it's certainly inappropriate for a Justice Secretary, a CABSEC for Justice, to be telling sentencers how to do their job. But I think those of us engaged with community justice really need to do a better PR job to persuade the sentencers that, you know, a short prison sentence isn't the answer. Keep prison for the people who need it. And we need more alternatives to prison. We still need, I mean, the number of people who are in prison who are opiate dependent, they'll be getting a methadone script. I mean, it's huge numbers. I don't want to say 60%, it might be more, but I mean, it's a huge, huge proportion of prisoners. You have to think, had they not had that drug habit, but for that opium addiction, that heroin addiction, might they not have been committing crimes in the first place? So where are the residential places that we need to help to get people off drugs, and not just pat them in a methadone script, and actually try and get them clean and rehabilitated and living a life that's of value not just to society but to themselves? So it's really complex, really nuanced. I think it's good news. We still have to persuade the judges. We still have to put in place those props that are not, you know, third sector projects that come and go, those permanent props that people can believe will always be there. I think we're making progress in this agenda. We have a long way to go. Scotland still locks up more people per head of population than most of Western Europe. We have too many people in prison. I'm not going to tell you who shouldn't be there or what crimes shouldn't be there, but there's a lot of people in prison who might better be treated with rehabilitation, with, you know, extensive support in the community. So we're on a journey with that one, I think.
Now you made quite an interesting point there. You commented that some of these projects only have relatively short funding windows, and therefore you can't necessarily rely on them. If you're a judge handing down a sentence, you can't necessarily rely on a service still being there in 2 or 3 years when the funding is up. Is there any, or have you heard, I mean, obviously in the third sector you'll hear a lot about funding streams. have you heard anything about kind of longer funding streams becoming available for this sort of work?
No, is the short answer. Year-to-year grants from most funders, if you're lucky. Some funders increasingly are moving to 3-year funding. The luxury is 5-year funding. The point about the third sector is it should be innovative, flexible. It should change. It shouldn't be just another social work service. But increasingly with public sector cuts, particularly at council level, services like social work are relying more on the third sector. It's all very fragile. It's a fragile and complex, bits balancing on top of other bits. And you know what's easy? The police will always be there. The prison will always be there. That's the straightforward option. That's to return to the theme of being thoughtful. That's the unthoughtful option. So in the wider society, there does need to be more thoughtfulness. And we do also need to address the real issues that victims have. The real issues that people who've been victims of crime have. Now, the primary thing that victims want is it not to have happened to them, which we can't do anything about. Most victims don't particularly want to see the person that attacked them or stole their stuff, hung, drawn and quartered. Victims are not as vindictive as right-wing Tories would and the like would have you believe. But they do want restitution. They do want this not to happen to somebody else, which is to say, I didn't want this to have happened to me. I wished it hadn't. I don't want someone else to go through what I've gone through. So we need to address, those issues. And we need to let victims have a voice and let them have, their anger, their emotions that they're going through, but recognise that we don't need to fear the voice of victims because most of them will not be demanding retribution. If you give them I have seen a victim of crime demanding the death penalty for some 15-year-old boy that had scratched his new car. And I think we've all been that person from time to time. But, so it is again about thoughtfulness. The community justice agenda is one that is dead easy to whip up, soft injustice. We're not letting people in jail, we're getting people out. Very easy to whip up rhetoric around. And it has been and is a successful, thoughtful agenda. So I'm wishing Humza Yousaf the best of luck with getting this up and trying to make real progress with it. My suspicion is just it might take a lot longer than we think because we are still sending more people to prison than than most other Western European nations, despite most crimes falling. Which doesn't make sense if you think about it because there's other factors going on there.
And just very quickly then, you talked a wee bit about what victims want from the system. Do you think there is a bigger role that kind of restorative justice approaches could take in Scotland? And
do you know SACRO, the well-known third sector organisation that works with in the criminal justice field? SACRO have been promoting this idea of restorative justice and restorative justice practices for many years. And it doesn't really seem to have taken off. And I'm never quite sure why. Governments have all paid lip service to it, what a good idea it is, but nobody seems to want to fund it or to, root it in something so that people know it would be there. I think there's been many pilots, bits of it tried here, bits of it tried there, but there's never been a proper full rolled out service that, So, there's a gap between the rhetoric around it and the actual testing of it. The evidence seems to be that it does work, and for many victims, that's what they want. And for many offenders, it's incredibly challenging to be actually faced with somebody sitting there saying, this is what the impact you had on me was, this is what you did, and you need to own what you did wrong. It can be quite transformative in the lives of offenders and quite restorative for the victims, which restorative justice is for, or should be for victims, though not offenders. I worked at victim support for many years and we were quite strong on that. You shouldn't have a restorative process because the offender thinks it would be good and it would make the offender feel better. The victim has to be the one that agrees to the process, that wants the process, and it should be a victim-led process, not an offender-led process. And that would be the one caveat I'd put into it, which is controversial in some fields. But otherwise, I would like to see these approaches being embedded and properly tested and really rolled out and not just restricted to a pilot grant for 3 years here and a pilot grant for 2 years there. That would be something to really embed.
Yeah, I mean, it's always seemed to me that, like you say, just being face-to-face kind of it establishes a human connection that isn't there when, you know, you're just like scratching their car in the dead of night, or kicking the wing mirrors off, or whatever you've done. Actually having to be face to face with someone reminds you that, you know, you're both part of the same community, and, you know, you have to try and live together. It does seem like that would be a move to make. So we'll keep an eye on that one, and we will talk about it again, I'm sure. So we now come to another European story. This is what's going on in Italy. Giuseppe Conte, the Italian Prime Minister, has quit after blasting Matteo Salvini, the leader of the far-right League, as an opportunist for triggering a government crisis that could have what he called serious consequences for Italy. Conte said he would formally resign his mandate to President Sergio Mattarella after the close of the debate in the Senate today. Salvini is apparently eager to exploit the League's growing popularity by bringing about snap elections. And Conte said he's only looking after his own interests and those of his party. Calling on voters every year is irresponsible, Conte said, adding that the prospect of Salvini as Italy's next prime minister is worrying. By resigning, Conte has actually just managed to avoid a no-confidence vote that the League had been seeking. Conte, usually mild-mannered apparently, upped the ante against Salvini at the weekend, accusing him of disloyalty and being obsessed with closing off Italy's ports to migrants. The row erupted after Conte refused to sign an order banning the Open Arms migrant rescue ship from docking on the island of Lampedusa. So this is quite a bad sign all round. Luigi Di Maio, the head of the Five Star Movement, who are the largest party in Italy just now, signalled the imminent demise of Italy's coalition government by thanking Giuseppe Conte for his time in office. He said, "Whatever happens, I want to say that it's been an honour to work with you in the government." Di Maio said that Five Star lawmakers would stand by Conte, who's a law professor with no political affiliation. "Each of us knows that we are on the right side of history," he said. "The League will have to answer for its wrong decision to bring everything down, opening a government crisis in the middle of August just to chase the polls." Political sources told Reuters on Monday that Italy's opposition Democratic Party has held good initial contacts with Five Star over the possibility of a new coalition. And then the actual story that has triggered this, more than 10 migrants on a rescue ship stranded off southern Italy jumped overboard and tried to swim ashore today as the Spanish charity operating the vessel remained in a standoff with the Italian government. Italy has taken a very tough line on migrant entry, saying it has borne too much responsibility for handling African migration to Europe. Interior Minister Matteo Salvini said that the charity-run ships have become taxis for people smugglers. The charity says the situation on board is desperate and some migrants are suicidal. The passengers are sleeping jammed together on deck and sharing 2 toilets. Dozens of migrants have been taken ashore since the ship entered Italian waters because they were said to be minors or ill. Salvini suggested today that the charity was exaggerating the problems on board. Meanwhile, Spain has offered yesterday to allow the ship to dock at a Spanish port, and it and 5 other EU nations have offered to take the migrants in. It seems like a pretty messy story all round, to be honest. This slide into right-wing populism, nationalism, anti-immigrant sentiment. And I mean, to some extent, I do have to say it's understandable. Italy and Greece are not doing the best of all the EU countries financially, and they have taken the entire brunt of this wave of migration that we've seen from North Africa. But this, kind of stranding ships offshore and things doesn't sound like a great sign. It does sound a wee bit like building a wall on the southern tip of Italy. Do you know much about the situation in Italy? I
don't know much about Italian politics. I've always found it difficult, complex. I think because it is so many coalitions and it's never been something I've followed. But the migrant crisis, yes. I mean, we've all followed on an emotional level, seeing the boats, seeing some of those very vivid images of, empty life jackets, some of the really saddening images, of people who have lost their life. I don't have the solution, but Western European countries do have a responsibility to abide by human rights and the human rights charters and the human rights values that make us the Western European nation. It's something that's so proud, and the political history of Europe in the broadest sense is that we have a human rights, or we should have a human rights based approach. This is now hitting, as you say, up against the kind of Trumpian build a wall, send them back, leave them in a ship. And those two sets of values coming together across the world, in Italy, as in the UK, as in America, as in Hungary, as in those values of human rights against this kind of protectionism is the real battle in the whole of the Western world, I think, at the moment. Italian politics, I think it was Berlusconi that lost it for me, because I stopped taking it fairly seriously after that. But perhaps I should have, because, as you say, what do we do about people coming over from Africa? We have to have a human rights-based approach. We can't leave people living in squalor. Do we need to share them more widely around Western Europe? Then does that further escalate the far right and the kind of protests and things that we've seen that led to Brexit? It's incredibly complex. And the worst thing is, we lack the leadership. We lack the political leadership to lead us through this. We lack the political leadership that says we will work from a basis of human rights, we will work from a basis of humanity. And again, I pay tribute to Angela Merkel here, who did show leadership in this issue in the early days of the migrant crisis. So I don't have the solution.
Yeah, as you say, Merkel. Merkel paid quite a hefty political price for that. There's an argument that actually she made the smartest move, because if you say we'll take the first people, then generally you're getting the healthiest, the most educated, the ones that had some resources that they were able to. This was predominantly people coming from Syria and Iraq. But you're more likely to get the best people if you're the first one that puts your hand up and says we'll take some.
That's a dreadful phrase. Best people.
It is, but I know a few German people who have said that in some ways that was the smartest move she could make. She's got the moral high ground and has perhaps got the biggest economic benefit that Germany could get out of it. But as you say, the issues in both Italy and Greece are really difficult just now. I do have a lot of sympathy for people, particularly in the Greek islands. Especially in winter, those are not wealthy communities, and they're being really overwhelmed because the countries behind them are not taking their fair share of the burden off of Greece and Italy. As I said, there were 5 countries: Luxembourg, Spain, I think Portugal, Romania, France, and Germany. Yeah, have all offered to take some of this specific group, but it's a fairly constant stream coming now, and it does seem to be an almost intractable problem, especially when you have people governing Italy who are so hostile that they're not even letting people land.
It's horrific. But again, this is a global issue. It's not, I've talked about Europeans and the history of human rights, but obviously people are coming from somewhere. They are leaving for reasons. Where is the global leadership that's trying to, this is going to make me sound like I'm an impossible, hippie fantasist, but where is the global leadership that is starting to talk about more world equality, about sharing prosperity more widely, not just through Europe, but around the world, so that people don't need to leave in such large numbers, that people, of course, can travel and move, and that's something that we're all going to lose in the UK very shortly, sadly. But, what people don't come to Europe, people don't come from Africa to Europe, for fun, on a bet. They are coming because their life at home is not tolerable for them. How can we create a fairer world? And we need to think globally about some of these issues, but where is the global leadership? Even somewhere like the United Nations, where we might look to have global leadership, we know that America's hostile to the United Nations even. So, Yeah, it's very depressing times. It reminds me of, sort of between the two, First World and the Second World War, that lack of global leadership, the huge movements of people, the failure to enshrine human rights. Very worrying times. This is a very depressing programme. All we are is worrying about things.
Well, we have one more major story to cover here. This is one of the two reactors at the Hunterston B nuclear power plant, which were shut down last year, have been permissioned to return to service. Hundreds of cracks were found in the graphite bricks within the reactor cores at the plant in North Ayrshire, but the Office for Nuclear Regulation has now agreed that it is safe for EDF, the operator, to restart one of the reactors for a 4-month period. The other reactor remains shut, but EDF is seeking permission for it to reopen as well. Reactors 1 and 2 are already undergoing decommission. Reactor 3 was shut down in March of last year after more than 350 cracks were found in that graphite core, breaching the operational limit for the plant. Reactor 4 was closed later in the year, and the ONR has now accepted that the operational allowance should be increased from 350 to 700 cracks in each reactor. Reactor 4 has been allowed to operate for a 4-month period, but the regulator said longer term the condition was uncertain and the EDF would need to justify its safe operation beyond this period. He acknowledged that it was an emotive issue, but said the ONR's role was to make decisions based on an objective examination of the evidence. Somewhat unsurprisingly, the Greens have come out strongly against this. Pointed out that clearly these cracks demonstrate that it is a very old plant now. It's had its life extended several times already. And they've suggested that the workers at the plant could be doing decommissioning work for years rather than keeping it open. At the same time, we have heard of a potential new energy source that potentially could be a huge boon for Scotland. Scientists have developed a large-scale economical method to extract hydrogen from oil sands and oil fields. The process can extract hydrogen from existing oil sands reservoirs with huge existing supplies found in Canada and Venezuela. The process can be applied to mainstream oil fields as well, including fields that are essentially exhausted for liquid oil, but producing hydrogen instead of oil. This is a group of Canadian engineers have developed a cheap method of extracting the hydrogen. They've been presenting this work at the Goldschmidt Geochemistry Conference in Barcelona. So the researchers have found that injecting oxygen into the fields raises the temperature and liberates H2, which can then be separated from other gases via special filters. Hydrogen is not pre-existing in the reservoirs, but pumping oxygen means that the reaction to form hydrogen can take place while leaving the carbon in the ground. This would reduce the current H2 production costs from around $2 per kilo as they are now to between 10 and 50 cents per kilo. And around 5% of the hydrogen produced then powers the oxygen production plant, so the system more than pays for itself.
Sounds good.
It sounds incredible. Grant Strem, one of the scientists involved, said, just taking Alberta as an example, we have the potential to supply Canada's entire electricity requirement for 330 years. Our initial aim is to scale up the production from Canadian oil sands, but in fact we anticipate that most of the interest in this process will come from outside Canada as the economic and environmental implications make people look very hard at whether they want to continue conventional oil production. Declining oil field production infrastructures now stand to get a new lease of life, and extensive field testing will be crucial in assessing how the system works on industrial scales over time. So that sounds like a tremendously positive thing if we can find uses for these oil wells producing a vast amount of energy over potentially a very long time.
A lot of science there. I'm not sure I'm following it all, but it sounds good, and it sounds less terrifying than somebody counting the number of cracks in a nuclear reactor and deciding how many are safe, which sounds vaguely terrifying to normal people.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I have to trust the regulators to know what's safe and what isn't, but it does seem like if they're saying you can try for 4 months and then we'll have another look, it doesn't seem like it's got a long life. and we don't have a great deal of other conventional oil production remaining in Scotland anymore since the closure of Longannet. So this sounds like it does sound like a very exciting process, and of course, when we hear people saying we need to keep the oil in the ground,
yes, and some people very strongly
and
arguing that.
I mean, it's the Greens' constant refrain about Scotland's future is that we have to think about what we're going to do when we leave the oil in the ground. But burning hydrogen produces water and nothing else. So if we could produce a hydrogen-powered plants, it does seem like a very clean way of still generating energy. We did speak to Paul Wheelhouse earlier today. He is aware of the research and he is looking into it. So we may see more from the Scottish Government on this as this technology develops. I mean, it's brand new technology. You don't know how quickly it will be available, but I definitely think it's a positive sign.
It sounds, yeah, because the arguments about keeping the oil in the ground are kind of convincing, but also the argument for the importance of oil to the economy are also kind of convincing. So if we can please everybody, if we can find a way to get the energy without having to drill the oil or without having to frack, which is, of course, the really terrifying thing, that will be good.
And I mean, there's an awful lot of jobs in Aberdeen that rely on oil, and it's all well and good to say we do need to leave it in the ground because climate change is happening, but we would have to be prepared for quite a substantial economic hit in parts of the country, and hopefully this can be something that takes us in the right direction. And just our final story tonight. This is not somebody I would admit that I had heard of, but the life and work of an important historian known as the Travelling Scot will be honoured in a ceremony in Perthshire today. Professor Robert William Seaton Watson's contribution to the history of Slovakia will be marked by the laying of a wreath at his grave in Abernethy. The event will be attended by Veterans Minister Graham Day and the Slovakian Ambassador to the UK, Lubomir Rehak. Professor Seaton Watson, who was born in London to Scottish parents in 1879, was one of the first British historians of Central and Southeastern Europe, and an expert on tensions within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His academic and political work helped prepare the ground for the recognition of several Central European states, including Czechoslovakia, at the end of the First World War. He died on Skye in 1951, and he was buried in Abernethy's Kirk of St Bride. There are more than 2,500 people born in Slovakia living in Scotland, including many of the Roma that we talked about earlier. And a Slovakian consular office opened in Glasgow in 2016 to help develop trade, investment and cultural links. Mr. Day said, "It is an honour to celebrate the life of Professor Seaton Watson and recognise his contribution to the history of Slovakia. I take great pride that the Scotus Viator, or the Travelling Scot as he was known, had an instrumental role to play in the Slovakia of the present day. The Scottish Government is committed to deepening its relations with Slovakia and our other European neighbours in spite of the challenges posed by Brexit and the needless damage it threatens to impose. This is also a great opportunity to emphasise that Slovakian nationals remain warmly welcome in Scotland, and their contribution to our economy, culture and society is greatly appreciated." I thought this was just a really nice story. We often underestimate the impact that Scots have had on other parts of the world, and I think this is just another great wee story. Was this someone you had heard of?
I hadn't heard of him, but I mean, I'm aware of the long history of Scots in Poland in particular. So yes, these wonderful sort of turn of the century gentlemen that didn't bother about passports or free movement, but just went around the world doing things. And sadly, it did tend to be men. Women weren't necessarily, given the same amount of freedom. So yeah, he sounds fascinating. Of course, there is another reason for the Scottish Government to be very keen to promote ideas of Slovakia, and that is, of course, because it had a velvet divorce from the Czech Republic, which would be something the SNP Scottish Government would perhaps like the Scottish public But maybe I'm suggesting that politics is a Machiavellian thing. But, you know, that perhaps that might be something they would like the Scottish public to know more about, how Czech and Slovakia split up. But I'm sure it's in its own merit and nothing more than that.
I'm sure I would never accuse any politician in Scotland of being Machiavellian. So just before we go, folks, thank you very much for joining us. Producing TV programmes is an expensive business, and in order for us to continue making programmes and paying the bills to run this studio, we do need more of you to sign up as Broadcasting Scotland supporters. So please go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register. Your £5 a month would make an enormous difference. And with that, that's all we've got time for tonight. I'd like to thank Kathleen Caskey very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure. And thank you all for joining us as well. We'll see you again tomorrow night. Thanks. Good night.